What's going on, everybody? We are doing I'm so happy we're doing an episode back to back. It's pretty awesome that we get to do that.
Finally.
In that regard, and maybe we'll have another episode here tomorrow as well, potentially. But yeah, if you guys don't know us, we are Axioms on Trial. We try to have conversations about philosophy, theology, science, really anything and everything that has a claim involved. We like to kind of break down. I'm Mike. My co-host is always Cease. Cease, how you doing, bud?
Good. I'm glad that we're able to do one back-to-back as well. And, before we start, I just wanted to make a comment about yesterday's show. Because I think there was something in that conversation that I forgot to mention. And I wanted to sort of clarify that now. And which was, so he, was it Luke? Was that his name? Luke?
Yes, Luke, yeah.
He was talking about, his argument was based on this idea of uniqueness, and how humans are unique in the way that we think and self-reflect and perceive. And the one thing that I didn't think about, saying there is that, yes, while it may be true that we're unique in that one instance, every species on Earth is unique in its own way, in its own thing. Like birds are unique in the way that they can fly, and no other species can fly. Like we can't fly. Certain other species are stronger than us, faster than us, live longer or not as long as, we can look at any species and find something unique about the species. Why should we focus on one particular difference as though it's more valuable than any other? It's just, it just doesn't really follow.
Yeah, and that was one thing. It's probably for a better that I had my laptop go out at the end there, but usually I come back and try to ask some questions, at least to kind of maybe to see if I can bridge one last point between you and the guest or whatever it might be. And for that one, I wanted to be able to come in and kind of ask what that uniqueness entails, and what it would be said for any other organism that has its own kind of uniqueness, and how you kind of draw the line between those two, and have the kind of what he's postulating be indicative of what he thinks it is, which I guess is this kind of introspect that gets you to God. But for me, it was what it was I think it was great. We both agreed it was a really good conversation, and one that was different and probably will be different from a lot of the other ones, since you kind of broke down some pretty niche things within the worldview claims. But yeah, so the episode we're going to try to get into today is going to be the general kind of like, is the gospel reliable? Or, we'll get kind of Cease's analysis on that, mine as well. I want to kind of break down Q source, why I don't agree with it, kind of the route I take on that, and all that. So, Cease, before I guess we get started on Q source, is there anything that you wanted that pertains to this topic you kind of want to throw out there right away? Or
well, yeah, I'll read a quote from Bart Ehrman that I think is valuable for this conversation. He says the following, and this is in his book called Jesus Interrupted, Revealing the Hidden Contradictions in the Bible. He says, the Bible is filled with discrepancies, many of them irreconcilable contradictions. Moses did not write the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not write the Gospels. There are other books that did not make it into the Bible that at one time or another were considered canonical. Other Gospels, for example, allegedly written by Jesus' followers Peter, Thomas, and Mary. The Exodus probably did not happen as described in the Old Testament. The conquest of the Promised Land is probably based on a legend. The Gospels are at odds on numerous points and contain non-historical material. It is hard to know whether Moses ever existed and what exactly the historical Jesus thought. The historical narratives of the Old Testament are filled with legendary fabrications In the book of Acts, the New Testament contains historically unreliable information about the life and teachings of Paul. Many of the books of the New Testament are pseudonymous, written not by the apostles, but by later writers claiming to be apostles. The list goes on. So.
Yeah, and actually, it's funny you mentioned that because it's a really good book, one that I'm actually reading now. And I didn't know that's where the quote was going to pull up from, but yeah, anything with Bart on there is really good. A lot of what I'm going to touch upon today in regards to Q source is going to be a lot that's been spoken by a guy named Dr. Mark Goodacre, who is Duke University's, I believe, chairman of religious studies. He has a very specific title that they've given him that I can't remember off the top of my head. But that'll kind of break down into what Q source is and kind of what are the implications of that. But I guess before I would get into that, I'd want to say, we can do the general reliability stuff kind of afterwards. I guess I'll just go ahead and get into it. For a lot of people who don't know what Q source is, you're gonna, the obvious question kind of is, what is Q source? And essentially, it's this hypothetical source that explains the double tradition that we see within Matthew and Luke. And so I have an image that I can pull up here to kind of give a better understanding of that. And so when we kind of look at the Gospels here, we're gonna see like the triple tradition, where if you're taking an aspect of Markan priority, that is that to say that Mark was written first. We now have these kind of similarities between Luke and Matthew. And so you'll see that in the purple there, which is the triple tradition. The double tradition, that blue percentage there, I'm sorry if you're colorblind, by the way, but that blue part there with a 23%, I believe, it's really small on my screen. That's the double tradition within Matthew and Luke that is not accounted for simply by analyzing Mark. And so what Q source does with that double tradition is try to essentially find kind of the source that they are deriving that material from. And so the material within the double tradition isn't going to be accounted for in Mark, even under a Markan priority position. And so the question you're left with is, why do Matthew and Luke have this double tradition that can't be accounted for in Mark? Q theorists are going to basically have this source to account for it. And the thing that I find, I guess, the most interesting, what we, me and C's like to do on the show a lot, is kind of compare alternate theories. And by no means is this a theory that I've come up with or anything like that. I'd say Mark Goodacre is a good proponent of this. There's also a few other guys that have kind of taken this line of reasoning. And so the thing is that to look at this from a more simple position, I would say, is you basically are having to compare two alternative theories. The first theory, if we go with Q theory, is going to be that there is this hypothetical source named Q for which we don't have any evidence for at all, but that best accounts for what we see in the double tradition. And so Assis, I would ask you, like, just kind of off the top of your head, or like, what do you think? Like, if you were to think of any other way that they could derive that information, does that seem to be, like, off surface level, like the most compelling theory, or like what would you say, kind of off the surface level there?
That already sounds like, I don't know, a scrambling of information to try to make a story fit. Like, how is this a non-existent source just like imagined into existence? And then, like, I don't know, I'm not as knowledgeable about this stuff as you are, so I'm not. I mean, I've read the Bible, read the Quran, but not into that level of depth.
Sure.
So I'm not sure. It just seems strange.
Yeah, and well, so the significance of, like, Q source, or I guess what really draws a lot of Christians to it, I think that, at least from my standpoint, that seems to be kind of like an emotional basis of, like, it's kind of like two prongs. So you get this idea of being closer to a historical Jesus within Q source, and then you also have the fact that it doesn't have this passion narrative that you would see if you read Paul's epistles, which is about you can get into the resurrection, crucifixion. Same with the Gospels or the Hebrews, where you don't see this passion narrative,
Right.
and so there's that significance from somebody that's going to be agreeing with that. So now the alternative theory that I kind of mentioned before, that I would say that you could compare this to, which seems just watching Dr. Mark Goodacre or other people speak about this, and I've done about a good solid year of just kind of keeping up with different alternative theories, and there's a lot out there. This one seems to be the most simple on its face, and that is that Luke had a copy of Matthew. And so you could explain where the double tradition is simply by the fact that Luke has this copy of Matthew. And so now you're kind of in a position of, how I could postulate that, but what's actually going to get you to that point is going to be, I guess, what most people are going to kind of get there. But would you say, like, Cecil, off of that, we compare those two theories, like Luke has a copy of Matthew and can derive that information accordingly, versus a hypothetical source that we don't have at all to appeal to? Just off the surface level there, like what would you say?
Well, obviously the first option is preferable, but both seem highly speculative. The first one not so much, obviously. It's obviously preferable, but it's just strange to me. Like, I don't know. None of these things seem historical approaches to me. Just like kind of speculating vaguely. I don't know. It's bizarre.
Yeah, and so my kind of thing that I always would think about is like, because that's kind of my thing, is it seems like there's this evasion of kind of looking into antiquity. So like that's what with the theory that I would ascribe to, that I think makes the most sense, would be Luke having the copy of Matthew. We can actually look within antiquity and kind of see these indicators for that. And so one thing that you've probably heard me talk about a lot on Discord debates is editorial fatigue. And so this idea of editorial fatigue, which is also known as docile reproduction, takes I guess the best way to kind of put an analogy to it is like when you go to a movie and you see in one scene, and this isn't entirely analogous, but it could help draw the point, is that maybe you see in one scene the actor has no facial hair at all, and then in the next scene you see kind of like a 5 o'clock shadow. Well, you could kind of use those two to make a clear decision that they probably weren't filmed in the same day, or if they were filmed hours apart. And so then you could then start to use different context clues to figure out which one is written first. And so when you look into like Mark and priority, if you look into this idea of analyzing antiquity, we go from, say, Mark's position. There's a couple examples that I think are pretty well used that I can throw a graphic up on here now. And so the first one is going to be, when we look at Mark, we get Herod Antipas is referred to as King Herod. And so we see here in Mark 6, King Herod heard about this, for Jesus' name had been well known. And so this is going to be the story of when John the Baptist is beheaded. When we look over here to Matthew, we see that there's a change from a king to a tetrarch. And so a lot of people aren't going to think that that's a pretty big deal. Like what is even the difference that you would get into? And I'll pull this down real fast. And so what's like most important, I guess, about the tetrarch aspect there is that tetrarchy is going to be a specific division of rulership into fourths. So we could look at the tetrarchy of Judea established after the death of Herod the Great. You get this tetrarchy within antiquity that shows a distinction between a king kind of ruling over the entire area, which would be Mark's version, what Mark essentially thinks Herod is, a king, versus Matthew, who has now changed this to tetrarch. Now, the reason he's changed this to tetrarch is because Matthew comes later. And so if I go back kind of to the verse here, Matthew realizes that he's kind of messed up here. So what he decides to do is change that. Now we look at Luke, you can see kind of the similar thing where it's referenced as tetrarch. And so now we have this kind of idea where within Matthew, if you go look at Matthew 14:9, he reverts back to calling him a king. I have that highlighted in red. The reason that you do that, or that he does that, is what we reference when we say editorial fatigue. It's to say that he's looking at his source Mark, at which he's copying from and making changes to, which is the tetrarch change. But then by the time he's at 14:9, he's become overwhelmed with his source and forgets the change that he's made and reverts back to calling him a king. And so sorry, go ahead.
I have a question. So why make the change in the first place? And then does he realize that does he realize later that he made this error?
So the change there is I would say the change there is because they have an understanding of the proper rulership there. Like they understand antiquity. They're changing that because I think it could be simply written off that Mark, you could say Mark didn't know, right? Mark didn't have an understanding of the difference, and that's fine. Like whatever kind of argument you're going to use there, I'm okay with. Because the issue isn't in regards to Mark, it's within to Matthew. Matthew makes a clear decision to change this. He makes a clear decision to go, I'm going to change it to tetrarch, which is a ruler of a fourth, is a completely big difference from a king. And so now when he goes to the line that he is, said king, well, one could just say, well, that's just a mistake that he had made. Well, we're not using this to say that the Bibles aren't reliable. What we're trying to do is paint a picture of who comes first. And when we use these examples, we know Mark comes first. And so that's not the only example we could use. We could also use an example after the Sermon on the Mount, in which we see Matthew coming back to this triple tradition, but he's mentioning large crowds. And so I think I have a graphic for this one. Hopefully this is it. And so when he heals, this is the story of healing the man with leprosy. And so Matthew, which is at the top, I accidentally cut off the name of that. But and when I reference Matthew, I don't mean Matthew. I mean the authors of Matthew, or the authors of Luke, or the authors of Mark, so I can be specific. But he introduces large crowds in almost all of his stories. So you can see here at the top in Matthew 8 here, when Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing. He said, be clean. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, see that you don't tell anyone. Okay, so now there's this huge distinction to not tell anybody about this. This comes from, if you look at Mark, is the fact that this is a private thing. It says a man came to him. There's no mention of these crowds, nor would it make any sense to mention these crowds, because if you look at 44, see that you don't tell anyone and show yourself to the priest. Okay, that line's kept there, and if you look up at at Matthew, see that you don't tell anyone there. That's another example of what we would say in regards to the editorial fatigue, is that why would you introduce large crowds such as Matthew does to heal a man with leprosy and say, don't tell anybody? Because the story of this is that the man goes off and just tells people anyway. But if you had done this in front of a large crowd, there would have been no point to have made that. And so this is another. And anybody would have kind of writing this could understand this, but since he doesn't, we use this as another context clue to say that he is overwhelmed with his source again, Mark, and keeps that line in there. So like any I guess like what would you say up to that point, or like anything that would there be anything you would want to add?
Yeah, I mean this is why I think it's really amusing when Christians claim that this is the perfect word of God, or that at least that even if it's made by people, that it's so divinely inspired that there are no real contradictions. Like, no, there clearly are. Now, I don't know, what do you make of the argument that somehow these inconsistencies actually give the Bible credence? Because I've heard that argument before. I never understood that.
So, okay. Well, I wouldn't. So, like, I wouldn't. It depends on like what we're talking about in some aspects. I would say no off the face there. It's like that doesn't seem I don't see how that would work. But at least what we do in this is to say, let's not worry about the discrepancies, right? Like, let's say when we see these things with Tetrarch, and King, which, by the way, if I go back to, that's a direct distinction between a system of government from Diocletianic, I think is what it's called, arrangements, versus this aspect of a tetrarch. So you have this complete distinction, which is a huge distinction to be made. But let's set that aside and say, we're not talking about the validity at the moment. We're not worried about its implications of the validity of your story. We're just using this to kind of paint a picture of who comes first. All right. And now we're using all these context clues. Mark clearly comes first when we look at these clues, because clearly the changes are coming after Mark. And why is it that Luke and Matthew, if you look up in those graphics, that Luke has the exact same changes, what are known as these minor agreements that Matthew and Luke have? They're written off as minor agreements. Like, why do we have this overlap between the two if Mark isn't coming first in the first place, right? Right. Another example of that to use would be when Jesus is being ridiculed by soldiers. So in Mark, they spit on him and they say, prophesy, right? So now when you go to look to Matthew, well, it says prophesy. You go to Luke, it says prophesy, but they've added the same 5 words, not just in English. This is the same 5 words in Greek. Who is it that struck you? So now if Mark and Luke have, this is part of the double tradition here, right? If Mark and Luke have this distinction between them, I'm sorry, if Matthew and Luke, apologize, Mark and Matthew, I get confused. If Matthew and Luke have this similarity where they add the same thing, well, then why is it that, are they deriving it from the Q source? I mean, that's what the Q theorist is going to have to say, right? That they're getting it from that same source. The aspect,
why complicated?
Well, so yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I take it, right? It seems to complicate the theories. But when we build that picture, right, we go from, all right, well, now we can establish Mark and priority. Not a problem there. We'll probably all agree, or at least most scholars do anyway. Now we can go into, did Matthew have a copy of Luke? Did Luke have a copy of Matthew? Or did they both have this copy of, or did they both kind of have this source between the two, which would be, Q source. And so Dr. Goodacre in his book, I'm going to quote it, he has that the solution here would be that if Luke has Matthew as a source, the greater gap between Matthew and Luke, the less likely it becomes that Luke did not have a copy of Matthew. Conversely, the shorter the gap, the more likely Luke did have a copy of Matthew as a source. And so now you're going to be able to kind of draw these parallels to that being the case. Because if you want Q theory to work, you're going to have to maintain that Matthew and Luke were writing about at the same time. You're going to have to keep the narrative that they didn't know each other, or else the Q theory is going to fail. And so, like, a lot of this, I know, gets confusing, and when you start kind of breaking down why they have these kind of similarities, or some people will write them off as kind of minor agreements, but we know Luke comes later because you can make references where he knows things. It's as if he knows Josephus. He knows these things that happen kind of after the fact, and they're being written about. And so you use all these context clues to kind of get to the conclusion that he's got the copy of Matthew in that case. And so all this is a long-winded way to say is that the Q source fails because we can literally parallel these exact same changes. And not even that, we can see that when Luke writes, or the authors of Luke write, we see like these Matthean details keep rising, or the structure of how things are said. We go back to the Herod example. Well, Luke has no problem with the tetrarch there. And when we look at how the things are written, we see very quickly that it's using very similar kind of writing style in order to derive that from. And so you essentially get to this idea that you can't really reconcile this hypothetical. You can't posit this hypothetical imaginary source as credible over just the simple notion or hypothesis that Luke had a copy of Matthew, especially when we look at antiquity and see the changes versus what he knows that Josephus has said, and then when we date them accordingly. And so that would be kind of the best way to explain that, at least in terms of the Q source and why editorial fatigue matters. It's not to say this disproves the Bible or this is contradictions that I'm using to show why I don't believe in your Bible. It's to say, here's why we have mark and priority. Here's the examples we use in editorial fatigue. And here's why, accordingly, we also think that Luke had a copy of Matthew.
What I don't understand is why Q source would even be on the table. Like, why complicate the situation by adding another factor as opposed to just saying that the two had copy, that one had a copy of the other? Like, what's the purpose?
Well, so for me, then that, like, for me, I guess I can only speak from someone like myself who would look into these things and try to see, like, because my thing is, like, I'm going to inherently think it's not that these aren't reliable just based off the anecdote. Like, that's already my first problem that we're going to touch on upon here more so, which is definitely more fun than being bogged down by all these, hypotheticals and everything. But when I do look into it, because I think that the story fascinates me, like, the first thing that I think of when I see, like, why someone would want that, right? Or, like, why they posit these ideas, like, it seems to save face, because it then becomes very easy beyond just, well, I don't believe in it because of this aspect of anecdotal testimony. Now it just becomes, well, the anecdotal testimony is super unreliable in the aspect of that we can see where things are being copied. So now, who do I trust? Do I trust Matthew? Do I trust Luke? Do I trust it? To me, that seems like it seems to be this trying to fit in an answer of that there aren't any problems here because they're deriving all this information from a source we just don't have yet.
Sorry, but what is the difference?
Copying each other, right?
But what is the difference if they're getting information from each other, or if they're getting from another source? Aren't they still getting it from a source? What's the difference?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of another good point to raise, is that you don't seem to solve kind of the issue there by positing a source or rejecting, say, Goodacre's position of Luke Luke having Matthew, because essentially I feel like you're arguing the same thing in that regard, right? I mean, you're arguing the same source or the same aspect of copying a source.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like I don't see what gets resolved there. It just seems to me like.
Well, so it's what to account for, and there's not they're not going to say that that's inherently an issue for their theology. They're going to say that that's part of the theology, like that's it. The weirdness for me comes involved where it's like it's an issue when the alternative hypothesis that you don't agree with, you raise the issue, or you seem to have the issue with this idea of the copying there, but you don't here, and it's really to what you're saying, but yeah, it's like you get them out of the box and they're like, well, that doesn't work for this reason. Like, for example, there's this issue with the prophesy quote that I put in Mark 14:65, where you don't have, like, so if that happens, right? So we have the who is it that hits you that's added in Luke and Matthew. Well, the Q theorist is going to say, well, it's okay that they overlap there. It's fine. Like that's what they're going to admit, that there's an okay. They got this from that Q source. But then you forget, like, the significance that I said earlier about Q source is that it doesn't have a passion narrative. So there should not be this spit in your face, prophesy, who is it that hit you, do your magic. There's no passion narrative with that. That does not exist within those stories. And so it seems, at least to me, before I lose my point, that if you're going to worry about what's being copied, it seems to just kind of be arbitrary, right? Like how you're posing it. It just seems to be like a very arbitrary aspect of, like, well, it doesn't fit the theory, so it can't be copied here. But my theory can ascribe to those same kind of concepts that you have in yours, which seems to be odd to me. I don't know if I'm making any sense there.
No, you are. No, I get what you're saying.
but yeah, so I mean, to move all the way from that, I wanted to go briefly on that. It hit like 30 minutes. I thought that would be a little smaller than that, or shorter than that. But in regards to just like the reliability of that, like, then for me at least, it just gets into the anecdote to begin with, right? It's like I always kind of use the example. I did this with T-Jump the other night. We had a conversation with somebody, and it was, if your wife came to you and said that she saw the risen Tupac, like, would you believe her off the anecdote? And of course you wouldn't, right? It doesn't matter if it's the most trusted person. But why is it that you trust Paul from someone that you don't know about 2,000 years ago? That to me seems to be kind of just highlights the whole issue there. I don't know. What would you kind of say?
That was a hilarious conversation, by the way. I was,
yeah, really, it was funny.
It was really great. It doesn't make any sense. Like, even because of course we can approach the trustworthiness of these things by saying, look, these things were written way after the fact. It's based on hearsay of hearsay. A lot of things we know are constructed. Gospels that were left out. Other things were added later. There is a severe shadiness with the way that all these things were compiled in the first place. But let's pretend that none of those are issues. Let's pretend that the Gospels were written by contemporary eyewitnesses. That we have, rather than in the context of the resurrection, for example, the 500 witnesses. That is not a historical fact by any means. So nobody in the actual field considers it a fact. But let's pretend like that we had the actual names of give the opposition as much ammunition as they want. It doesn't solve the problem, because we know through studying psychology and through studying the limitations of perception and how easily people can be fooled, and all the instances in history where people were convinced to have experienced a certain thing, only for then science to discover later that these were entirely explainable just through psychology. There was nothing real here. It was just misconceptions or confusions about phenomena. You don't get any kind of farther support for the supernatural claims of the Bible, and even for general claims. So it just seems to me like, I know this is a little bit sort of not exactly related to the issue of fatigue, but when I just think of, even if somehow we were to eliminate this concept, it wouldn't resolve the problem as far as I'm concerned. Testimony isn't reliable, and it's funny always. Also, when religious people say things like, eyewitness testimony is so important in a courtroom. Have you heard that before?
Yeah.
It's like they don't know what they're talking. Like, first of all, DNA evidence is far more important than any kind of testimony of that kind. We know that memory is really bad, actually, and if you can take two people who are both in the same situation, and they're going to recall the same situation almost entirely differently. They're going to change who was there, what they were wearing, the sequence of events. For example, in the example of an attack, there have been examples of them changing the narrative of what weapon was used. And then think of it this way: like, anybody that makes an argument is essentially saying that if you went into a courtroom and said, "I saw a ghost kill person X," would anybody take this seriously? So why are we talking about eyewitness testimony in the context of a supernatural claim that hasn't been proven as actual and not just imaginary?
Yeah, and we actually have examples too of. I would be hard pressed to find an example of single testimonies convicting anybody, and then I'd also feel like I'd be hard pressed to. Well, actually, I know for a fact that in court cases that have offered up any kind of supernatural basis for something, they're immediately thrown out. They're not taken seriously in a court of law in any way at all. And so to use the courtroom analogy is kind of unfair to say that, well, I could use the anecdotal testimony the same way I could in the court case. Well, okay, well, let's keep the analogy. Let's move to the courtroom, and let's remember that this isn't like I saw an accident. This is like I saw two flying cars, that poofed in and out of existence and came back, right, or something. Like, you got to remember that in reference to the anecdotal testimony that you're giving is in reference to an extraordinary supernatural claim. So you couldn't just take that analogy and say, well, we use all these anecdotal testimonies for ordinary claims. It's like,
it's clearly not the same thing.
Like, because when someone murders somebody, like, clearly and someone sees it, like, that can be of value, especially if we have footage to correspond with it. Like, hey, we have CCTV, you're standing there, you were a witness. That adds some credibility to the case. Like, there's more to it than just that. And we're also not talking about, like, this extraordinary claim of divinity in any aspects. And so that part it seems to just kind of bug me when that's being used as the analogy there.
My other favorite talking point is when they're like, oh, well, you believe in George Washington. It's like, yeah, because we're not claiming George Washington fucking resurrected.
Well, you also have examples that it's worse than that, because you have, like, so I'm going to lay down, like, I'm not a mythicist. I agree Jesus likely existed. Do I think that I have a very good basis that is the case? No, because we do not have contemporary evidence, right? Do I have more confidence that George Washington existed? Well, yes, and I'm not even going to do it for the fact that, like, he's on our dollar bill and he was a president. Like, not even that. We have contemporary evidence with him, like the Treaty of Paris. We have right. Contemporary evidence where other countries at a time where they had technological disadvantages could corroborate information overseas and have their accounts match up with our accounts, and not even just that, have world accounts match up with our accounts. And so that is a contemporary piece of evidence that you can't say for even someone like Jesus.
Why do we have so little evidence of Jesus outside of the Gospels? And the one piece of evidence that we have, or I think one or two, are so unreliable. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and so, well, for me at least, when we go to the kind of like to segue the editorial fatigue aspects, is like, you kind of have two things here where, say we take the Tetrarch example, like, right, so it either is first off, it has to be the case that Herod Antipas is a king or he's a tetrarch, right? It can't be both. Like, that's a contradictory in everything we know in antiquity. And so now you have an issue there where it's unreliable from that standpoint. But then it's being used to show how exactly one gospel, or the writers of one gospel, is copying the writers of another gospel. And so it's like twofold in this sense, where now the anecdotal testimony you're using in some aspect is corroborated for all the wrong reasons, not the reasons that you would want by any stretch of the imagination.
I want to pose this question that I think is interesting. Do you know if anyone classified prophets by number of eyewitnesses? If so, does belief scale with that number? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, do you know if anyone classified prophets by number of eyewitnesses? I can't say that I know that, right? I could say that I could see that being the case in a lot of aspects, but I would say the first thing I think of there is kind of like a miracle of Fatima or something, which I know is like a prophet, but to just show that the number of these eyewitnesses has been shown to be wrong, because what they experienced there was likely a perihelion, which, if you're not familiar with it, so real fast with the miracle of Fatima, there's 40,000 people that saw this apparition in the sky. Some claim that it was the sun itself moving in the sky. Well, they were all wrong if they thought it was the sun, and they were also all wrong if they thought it was of some divine aspect, because we actually know how a perihelion well, there's some debate about it, but we know that in the atmosphere, sunlight can refract off ice crystals, and what they do is they actually reflect off of like hexagonal surfaces of these ice crystals. And so at the 22 degree, what do you call it? The 22 degree halo from the observer standpoint, you see this kind of halo around the sun. We also see these with moon rings, which sometimes happens with like water vapor. I think those are called a corona, if I'm not mistaken. But essentially what you get there is this seeing an actual natural thing. Actually experiencing an event, right? You're actually seeing this 22 degree halo effect around the sun, this perihelion. But the 40,000 people are wrong about what it is that they think they've experienced. And this would be no difference for someone who thinks that they heard a ghost or anything. So that's kind of the first thing that comes to my head with the belief scale, with that number kind of idea.
Yeah. Now my favorite is the people that think they see Jesus in their pancakes.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Well, you know what? So that's actually interesting. People are bringing up great things. That's actually you know what pareidolia is?
Sounds familiar, but I can.
So pareidolia it deals with like how pattern seeking we are and how we see shapes. So seeing like a face in the clouds or numerology and those types of things is like forms of pareidolia. We are so victim to that, and people who have mental illnesses are victims of it. Like they're absolutely victims of this form of pareidolia.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that TS uses arguments like they don't realize how delusional and how unreliable perceptions are, especially when there's wishful thinking involved.
Yeah.
I guess the one thing that I'm curious to see how you respond to is, why do you think these religions and ideologies become established in the first place? Like, why were the Gospels written? Why were these things that were clearly fabrications added and contrived that way? Like, what was the purpose? Was it because I have my own theory, but I'd like to see.
Sure, I guess I'd have to ask a clarifying question. Is like, are you in reference of like the additions? You just mean like the additions to the Gospels in general, or like the kind of beginning amalgamation of the material?
I mean, all of it. I mean, the fact, for example, that there were things that were clearly fabricated.
Sure.
For example, Jesus' origin, like where he was born, is one thing that I think most scholars at this point think that was not actually true. Like it was, it was just a story that was constructed to sort of to fit the prior prophecy. So why? What is the purpose of? Because if you know that he didn't really fulfill the prophecy in that context, why lie about it?
Sure. That's actually a really good question. I'd say the example you use with the place is a really good one. I'm a little fuzzy on memory, but why they would is because of, especially with the places in reference to Micah 5:2. If I can pull up Micah 5:2, I have a note thing here of it, I think. Yeah. So, but you, Bethlehem, is this the right quote? I don't know if this is the right quote. Anyway, so I'll just go off the top of the dome. Yeah, so it's for me at least, it's just that forced prophecy, at least especially with the place in regards to Micah 5:2. So like if you want Jesus born in Bethlehem, like Luke does this with the census, right? So they make these kind of after the fact, post hoc kind of ways to fix things, where Luke tries so desperately in the second chapter of Luke, where he tries to get, if you have the census, which by the way, there was never a census under Quirinius or Caesar Augustus for that matter. It's just there was never a census. But what he tries to do is he tries to get it to where you have to travel back to where you had lived, right, to get kind of this to register for the census. But the problem is that wouldn't have mattered even if we were to hypothetically say that there's like a census. We would actually you would just go back to wherever your place of work would be at that case. But he tries so desperately to kind of fix that Micah 5:2 aspect where he gets him back to Bethlehem. So I guess the question for you would be like, why manipulation could be one, right? You could go with that they knew it was false. For me, that's a question I just don't get either, because it seems to be it's so clearly false that clearly the people who are devising this or changing this are changing it to either what they want, what they think is the case, or what they're doing pure out of manipulation.
But the question of intention remains. Like, yes, you can probably see it all. The question is why go through that process. My theory is that the same way with something like Scientology, people, it's about control. It's about constructing a kind of an ideology that will bring people to it, and a result, power. Now, yes, Christians were persecuted, but that's true for all religions, and to some extent, even the concept of persecution is used as sort of a furthering of a crystallizing of the dogma, because it's prophesied that you're going to be persecuted. They're looking at it in sort of the bigger picture, longer term type of.
Yeah, and so that's kind of what I guess the only reason I've strayed away from the control aspect is that I've tried to give it more of the benefit of the doubt of people genuinely believing these things. But the more I look into like editorial fatigue and seeing Matthew change, the Tetrarch example, or adding these crowds and forgetting, it does seem to be like that would have to be the case, right? That there's this level of
it just doesn't make sense.
But I kind of ask you as a counter response to be like, well, like let's take Isaiah 7:14, which is the virgin birth, that they get Alma's not even the word for it, and they mistranslate this in the Greek Septuagint to Parthenos, which sneaks in the virgin aspect. Like, would you say that it seems more reasonable from your perspective under that they knowingly they knew the Hebrew, but they chose to kind of have this change in the Greek Septuagint to Parthenos to kind of create this virgin birth, so to speak? Or would you say that could be an honest mistake, that they just didn't know that they're, you know what I mean? Like, how do you contextualize that with certain stories, I guess, is what
I don't, because to me, both, it could be just another manipulation and try to fit into previous prophecies, or
so it'd just be kind of speculation for you, kind of at any.
Yeah, and the thing is, like I said, I don't particularly find it that it matters, because like I was saying earlier, even if I want to give the theist all the ammunition they want, and to pretend like they have far more not evidence, but far more I don't know what the word would be, but their situation be less problematic. So where we don't find editorial fatigue, and we find contemporary witnesses and all these things, they still have all their work ahead of them, because it doesn't resolve the problem because of what we know about the human mind. Sure. and about, so to me, just like all the other stuff is sort of an extra cherry on top, as to show why these ideologies are ridiculous. But
let's zoom out for a second, like, so, because we know I spent 30 minutes going over a lot of boring stuff in the details. Me and you can kind of contextualize a lot more boring ass details within Isaiah 7:14. But let's zoom out and kind of look at this. For me, a huge problem, and I guess this will be less about the reliability here and more just kind of ideas that I have about this methodology to begin with, is that you have a methodology in writing it in the first place that allows for all these mistakes to happen, right? So now you've allowed for forgeries. You've now allowed, by doing this methodology, unknown authors, translations from languages, translations from dead languages,
right.
Missing documents. You could go down the list of why it's not good, but then it's rivaled by the other holy books that the God knows these fake ones use as a methodology, right? Or would have the foresight to know it, but chooses to use a methodology that rivals all the ones that are fake, right? And so you take those two things, I mean, on like a zoomed out level of it, it's unreliable regardless because it's put itself in a situation where the methodology itself is unreliable. It's to say
Sure.
you should take a presuppositionalist approach to your epistemic foundation or something, right? No, because I think the methodology is flawed to begin with, and I would say the exact same thing is that the text aspect of it is clearly indicative of the times, clearly indicative of the people, and clearly not indicative of a divine mind, from my perspective, at least.
And that's why, when we have theists on, I try to sort of point out to them is that they don't have any methodology to show that their beliefs are just not imaginary. Like,
yeah, how do you separate the words from some other words? Is essentially all you have to kind of break it down as, right?
So we have some questions. I'll pop up on here. Charlie wants to know my nationality.
Oh, nice.
I'm Italian. So I'm originally from Italy. I moved to the U.S. when I was 10. Never really lost my accent, I don't think. But I grew up, in Rome. Moved to some other places around Italy, here and there, Naples, other places. But yeah, I've been here a long time. Most of my life I've been in the U.S. So.
Yeah, we're both Italian Guidos, right? So, or whatever you would call it. I don't know. Whatever they call it. Except you're actually Italian.
Do you not see the correlation in people believing everything Trump sees? I think. Why do you think people? So, the first question is, I think people desperately want to feel part of something, and I think there's a real correlation between the worshiping of any individual and some kind of mental illness. I mean, when you hear Trump supporters talk about this guy like the best president of we've had in history, I mean, it's pure delusion at its worst. I mean, it just there is a toxicity in the ways in which these people believe, and a rejection, and that's the sort of the brilliance of that psychopath. To say that anything that goes against his narrative is fake news. So and I was talking to someone earlier today. I was arguing with a theist online today who was saying things like, he made a claim that the founding fathers were all Christian, which is laughable. That's not the case at all. And we have letters and documentation that shows some of them are Christian, some of them were not religious, some of them were deist. And the Constitution, the whole point of it was separation of church and state, freedom of and from religion. So their goal wasn't to create a Christian nation. This is complete bullshit. And the guy, I sent him evidence, and the guy, his response was, you just using the devil's words. You're just using people's words. Like, okay, well then any evidence I bring to you, you're going to reject as me being the devil, then fuck off, because there's no.
Yeah, I think it's the accountability aspect of it, right? Like you just basically, the reason what attracts these people to that so much is I don't have to be like, I'm sure some of these people might fear being wrong. I would say perhaps they have these fears of being wrong, but then they see this group where it's like, oh, I don't have to have accountability for the claims I make. That's attractive to me, and that's what I think that's what it is for me that I see.
I think people on that level are so far gone that it doesn't even enter their consciousness that they could be wrong, because they've already fallen into this sort of us versus them. Anything that goes against my narrative is the devil, and so I'm going to reject anything that I don't want to be true. It's sort of the lowest form of.
It must be nice to be that delusional where you can just create your own reality. I wish my brain could do that. I mean, not really, but
No. I think being aware of how little we know is actually freeing. I embrace that kind of chaos. Like, I don't need any kind of wishful thinking or any kind of comfort on the level. Like, I think it's pathetic.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there,
I would add just one last thing to that is that the aspect of the accountability to me is like me and my brother were having a conversation, and not to air out any information, but essentially he had a situation where someone we know for a long time had made some statements. My brother was like, "Hey, well, let me give you kind of an insight to why that's probably not true, on that political side," and then that person just proceeds by blocking my brother, deleting him, and we've known each other for 20-something plus years, having Christmas with each other almost, every year, right? And so people, I don't really can't really dive into it that much, but I think it's just this aspect of like that person that I know in that case was always somebody that believed in like chemtrails and all these conspiracies, that there's this emotional bias to what they want to be right. They want to seem like the smartest person in the room, and then they also just don't want accountability at any level in a lot of aspects of their life, not even just the claims they make. It seems that like in anything that they do, they just don't want this level of accountability. But that's.
And look, I mean, conspiracies do happen. There is some truth to some of them, but it's a matter of degrees, and the majority of these things are completely insane and don't have any basis, and it's just as dogmatic and as delusional as other forms of religion. So I don't know.
Yeah,
it's really, to me, it's political ideology is as close to or as toxic as religious ideology, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. So that would lead me into: do you think ignorance truly is bliss?
I mean, it depends on. I mean, obviously there are contexts in which it would be easier to not live in fear or concern if you're just not aware of what's going on in the world.
Let's use a huge example. Is ignorance of suffering, would that be blissful?
I think ultimately one is going to be better off dealing with reality and figuring out how to cope with that in a healthy way. Like, I would rather be that person. Yeah. While yes, I'm. It's going to be a harder path, but I'll be better for it in the end. If I develop the tools to sort of figure out how to cope with the reality of my existence. Sure. I would rather be that person and potentially on the way to that better state of bliss suffer some than just be ignorant and not know what the hell's going on and believe bullshit.
Yep. Sure. Yeah, and so we just hit the hour mark. This will be, I guess, a pretty short episode. I want to recap just real fast in case anybody came in late or doesn't want to have to kind of go back over any of what I said there. Sorry, I try to get some notes together and stuff. If I miss some things out, or if I mixed a Matthew with a Mark in there, which I'm sure I did, happens. But the kind of the general idea that we went over was, what is Q source, which is simply this hypothetical source that accounts for the double tradition in Matthew and Luke. We compared that to an alternative theory, which would say that Luke has Matthew. And from there, we used editorial and clues and docile reproduction to show why we think Mark comes first, so that we can now kind of draw the parallels to Matthew and Luke, to whether or not they had any knowledge of each other, which it seems to be the case that Luke does in that regard, which would draw for a better conclusion to say that Q source theory does not exist. Would be kind of the conclusion there.
So I do want to respond to a couple more comments here that I think are important.
Sure, yeah, definitely.
This one, I never befriended my friends because of their views on politics. I would never defriend them for it. I agree and I disagree. I agree in the sense that I think it's important to not live in an echo chamber and try to find common ground with people who disagree with you. So I think that's fine. My thing is, it depends on what the political belief is. Because when the belief is something that is destructive to human rights, then it's like, I can't just pretend like these beliefs don't say something about who you are as a person.
Sure.
So I think the context matters and the specific belief matters. So that's how I would respond to that. And the second thing, when James Randi debunked Peter Popoff, his followers were fierce with Randi. This might suggest that some people are glad to be fooled. I love James Randi, so I'm glad that that was mentioned.
Yeah, that's one I like to. It's probably the number one example I use for family members of mine or people that I know that might be a little bit more evangelical. Is to kind of show, it's like, hey, you remember Peter Popoff? Yeah. It's like, oh, here's how he got exposed, by the way. But I was gonna say about that was, I think Begin to Know makes a great point there, where when they get furious with the actual person who debunked them, it kind of tells you all you need to know about what's going on there. I mean, there's nothing you could have done. Like what reason can you provide to somebody that doesn't value reason? What evidence are you going to show to somebody that doesn't value evidence? It's just
right. Exactly.
It just comes down to that pretty simple phrase there. So before I guess we get off, if anybody doesn't have any questions that pop in before the end, Cease, if you have any kind of statements you want to say, either related or unrelated to the discussion. This was a one, so really anything goes here.
No, I'll say some of the episodes are going to be coming up. We're going to do one on evolution and examining whether or not something like irreducible complexity is a problem or not. We're going to do a video on Thomism and sort of delve into that a little bit deeper. We have some guests lined up. Two of them are professors. I think one of them, actually, I think two of them are psychologists. So we have some interesting, a little bit of a different type of content coming up.
Yeah, that'll be fun. I'm excited. And also, we reached back out to Matt Slick. He should be on the show here soon as well. Okay. And so that'll be fun. And then look out for some clips and things of that nature. I've already gotten one clip done that I just need to upload. And yeah, we'll be rocking and rolling in 2021. So we appreciate everybody tuning in. I know this was it's been a later one, the last two ones, and I understand this one might have been a little boring, but I wanted to just kind of knock it out of the way or get this done so that when I do an editorial fatigue narration video, I can kind of go back over this video and take some clips out of it or certain aspects out of it for the narration video. So thank you everybody for dealing with me and my nerdiness of the topic that not most people care about. So, but yeah, we love you guys as always. We will see you hopefully tomorrow.
See you next time.